Alright, so what we will do here in this video is talk about the introduction section of our group project poster. So if we return to our template, the introduction is this little section right here. So really, compared to some of the other sections we've gone over, it's not that long. It takes up about a third-ish of one of our columns. And so we'll talk in this video about what information you should include and how to go about putting the section together. So overall, for your introduction section, what you're doing here is setting up your audience member, the person who's reading or visiting your poster, with the information they need to, first of all, be interested in your poster. So think about if you can hook them in some way. And also what you want to do is convince them that the work you're doing is important. So you want them to understand that. So these are pictures I pulled from when we talked about the introduction section of our proposal from earlier in this semester. So the purpose of the introduction section on your poster is very similar. You're still trying to garner audience member interest and give them the background information they need to understand what you're laying out in your poster, but it's in this really mini condensed version because we don't have a lot of space on our poster. In terms of what information you should be including, here I get to bring back my funnel analogy. If you thought we were done with that, you were sorely mistaken. So when we talked before about the introduction section of our proposals, we talked about two main types of information. Going along with this funnel analogy, we talked about broad information or what's already known, and then we talked about specific information, what's not known yet. So we're going to include the same type of information in our poster, on our poster as well. So the first type of information you want to include in the introduction section of your poster is this broad information. What is already known about the topic that your group is focusing on? And here we're getting that information mainly from the literature. We've talked several times already for different sections of your poster about making sure you're doing literature searches and finding relevant papers that have done similar types of work or background papers. That's where you're going to get this information about what's already known about your topic. So here's an example that I pulled from the template I gave you, which is a poster I actually presented while I was in grad school. And this statement here is giving information about what we already know about this system. So this was included in the introduction section of my poster. And it says, recent work has provided phenotypic and gene expression evidence that Northern and Southern California populations are locally adapted to heat stress. And here I just pulled some images from those papers. So again, this is what is known, and we're getting that information about the phenotype and the gene expression from previous literature. So what has already been published and what has already been done in this field related to the topic you're focusing on. When we're talking about this information about what is already known, another subcategory of that is including information that's relevant about your study system, about your particular study organism. So I'll give another example based on that same template poster that I've given you. In the introduction section of that poster, I included these statements. I included this that says, quote, given its wide latitudinal range, individuals encounter different thermal environments. So what I have in bold here, this information that this species, this intertidal black turban snail, has a wide latitudinal range, that's important for the audience member to know. It's relevant because, as we talked about in our local adaptation module earlier in the semester, the wider the latitudinal range is, the more likely a species and populations of that species are to experience local adaptation because they're more likely to encounter different environmental parameters. So here I'm showing an image of the sea surface temperature along the California coast. We can see that the Northern California sites reach much lower temperatures and it's much warmer in Southern California. So that's relevant information about our study system we should include because it helps set the audience member up to understand the topic we're talking about on our poster. This other statement I have listed here says, while this might promote local adaptation, so like I just said, a wide latitudinal range makes local adaptation more likely. Seafoam umbrellas also has pelagic larvae, suggesting a high level of gene flow that could preclude or prevent local adaptation. So that's this image shown here. This is what the larvae of the black turban snail actually looks like, zoomed in a lot, of course. So here we're setting up this interplay. So we're saying, on the one hand, the fact that this species has a wide latitudinal range makes it more likely local adaptation will occur. However, the fact that this species has a pelagic larvae, which means it is planktonic, so it swims around in the water column, it doesn't settle down to be what we think of as a typical snail until later in the life cycle. And while you have this pelagic larvae stage, the larvae can be swept up by ocean currents and carried to locations far away from where the parents of that individual snail larvae were. And so if you have a lot of gene flow, that means both of your populations are going to be more similar to each other, which would prevent local adaptation. So in that poster that I gave you as a template, I was setting up how this species is interesting for us to look at local adaptation, because there are these two different factors that work against each other. So I'm setting that up here in the introduction, giving the audience member this relevant information. And once we've included that relevant background information about what is known, we then also want to give some specific information, and that's the information that we, don't know yet. And here is where we are basically returning to that knowledge gap that we have talked about previously. So we've talked about this with our proposals. When you're thinking about a knowledge gap, you're talking about how your work is going to fill this void to give us new information. And so in your introduction of your poster, you can do the same thing, give this explicit statement about what is not known and how your work will help to fill that. So here's an example, again, from my poster. Quote, this study will provide insight into the selective forces driving this local adaptation and the strength of gene flow opposing this selection. So this is the example from my template poster, like I said. I actually would be even more explicit than that. So you could say something like, what is not yet known is the selective forces that are driving this local adaptation and whether gene flow strongly opposes selection, something like that. But I would explicitly state something like what is not yet known is blah, blah, blah. So you can really make your knowledge gap very clear. Here's an example from my poster. This is the entire introduction section, so again, it's not very long. I'll give some details later about roughly how long it should be. So how do you go about rating this section? I would first of all recommend returning to all those literature search papers that you've already found. You've read a lot of these at this point, and what I would recommend is, since you already know your endpoint, right? That's why I have recommended to do these sections in this order. You already know your results, you already know what your conclusions are, so when you're thinking about writing information for your introduction section, you can help to set up your results to have the reader, the audience member already thinking about, okay, this is the gap, this is where the results are going to come in and help to fill that gap. And then what you want to do is rate that section. So as I showed on a couple slides ago, this section really just contains text. It's a relatively small amount of text. So overall, this section should be about 100 words. Again, it's not very long at all. That'll be about 5 sentences. And it should take up about 1/3 of a column on your poster. So really it's 5 sentences, and we need to make sure we're including broad and specific info. It's really just a sentence or two for each of those to fit in that relatively small section of your poster to hit about 100 words.